So there's no teaser today because we have a very special episode of Professor of Rock covering a legendary singer-songwriter who we lost. To me, it was one of the most devastating losses ever, and it got very little fanfare when it happened. There weren't a bunch of tributes. It wasn't front page news. It wasn't covered in the media almost at all, but it should have been. To me, he not only wrote some of the most beloved songs of the 70s and 80s, but he wrote modern standards with the purest tenor voice of his time. Songs like Part of the Plan, Longer, Leader of the Band, Same Old Lang Syne, Run for the Roses. Great album tracks like There's a Place in the World for a Gambler. And he influenced so many artists that would come after. His songs have been like checkpoints of our personal histories. His songs have become our songs and have connected multiple generations. Fathers, sons, mothers, daughters. If you haven't figured it out today, we're honoring Dan Fogelberg. Today we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of his breakthrough album, Souvenirs. It includes several standards, and I have some amazing guests, including his bass player, his engineer, and photographer for this record. And you're going to hear never-before-told stories and insights into Dan as an artist and as the teller of some of our favorite songs. Yeah, I did a video years ago where I said if I could interview any artist living or dead, it would be Dan Fogelberg. He was just a special artist, and he deserves to be remembered as one of the greatest ever to do it. And this album is appropriately titled Souvenirs because what Dan's music has always been is a time machine. It takes us back to our fondest memories that make us ache with joy. Here it is.
Throughout that time of touring with Barnstorm, Irving Azoff was our agent, and then he became our manager when he started working for Geffen Roberts. And he would talk about Danny at that point. He was Danny Fogelberg. His first client, his was like a brother to him. He went to LA to pursue, helping Dan out as a manager. And so he'd give us cassettes. And then we listened to him on the road. And finally, Joe said to me, hey, I'm going to produce Dan Fogelberg, and I want you to play. And Barnstorm was still together, but it was at the very end. And Russ Kunkel's going to play drums. And at that point, I think Bill Simzik had jumped on board to engineer, and we're going to L.A. So he and I went to L.A., and I had not met Dan until we got into the studio. And so that would have been 1974. It was Irving. Irving put this together. He really did. He got Joe involved. The first record with Dan, didn't have where Irving thought it needed to go. And when we got together in the studio, I'll never forget, when people ask me, you've played with Elton John, you've played with Joe Walsh, you've played with Stephen Stills, Crosby, Stills and Nash, Cat Stevens, I can go down the list. I said, Dan Fogelberg was the best artist, the true altogether artist. He was a poet, he was a keyboard player, he was a guitar player, he was an engineer, great singer, great arranger. So when we got in the studio, man, he knew exactly what he wanted to do. So if I was 24, he was 22. It was an incredible experience. I mean, I was listening today of, back to back, just the first four songs, which I played, those first four I played on. And then I did The Gambler on the other side of the record. But when I listened to that, the sound, and the part of the plan really got me in the world scene as a fretless bass player. Part of the plan is, Joe had given me a fretless a year before. Fender had given him, and he says, man, you got to learn how to play this. Russ and I bonded immediately, and Dan, we cut those basic tracks, just basically the three of us. Joe would put overdubs later. I think maybe in The Gambler, maybe Jerry Beckley of America might have played with us when we cut the basic. It was a phenomenal experience for me. And when I started to work with Dan, it was incredible, man. That first record was a turning point for my career and a turning point for his, and for Joe too. He got a producer credit.
One day we'll all understand.
Love Dan. He's one of my favorite singers ever. I think he's the purest singer of the rock era. Pure voice, just a
great songwriter. Yeah.
Yeah. Tell me about how you came to be with Dan. And I mean, of course, you already had so many famous photographs and album covers by that time, but this was 1974, and Dan was a young artist. This is only his second album.
Yeah, and I guess he came to LA to do that Souvenirs album, and I was living up in Laurel Canyon. I'd been living there for 10 years, and I'd recently gotten married. And my wife and I, every evening when we'd come up the hill from being out somewhere, there was a little rented cabin across the street from us. Various people lived there. And we started one night, we heard this beautiful piano music coming out of that little cabin. And we kind of walked up the steps halfway and sat there and listened for a while. It was beautiful. It sounded like maybe Joni Mitchell playing the piano. And that happened several nights in a row. And then I went out of town to go shoot photos on the road with somebody. And the next morning, my wife, Elizabeth, was out in front of our house watering the flowers. And a guy walks across the street and says, "Hi, I'm Dan Fogelberg." And she said, "I'm Elizabeth Dilts." And he said, "Dilts? Any relation to Henry Dilts?" I said, "I'm his wife." He said, "Wow, I've come to town to do this album, and I wanted to find Henry Dilts to do the album cover."
That's great.
And here I was right across the street. We became really, really good friends. I mean, I worked with the graphic artist, Gary Burden, and we took that picture at his house in Topanga Canyon. He had a real eagle feather, and we were just taking photos in the living room, and that one worked out really well. He was a real Renaissance man. I mean, he painted really well. He drew and painted. He photographed. He was a great photographer. He was like a classical pianist, a songwriter, a guitar player, and a gourmet cook, And he was, he really was a Renaissance man. He was into so many things. We had such great conversation.
Dan Fogelberg's voice was something that was just so subtle and so warm, and it was like an old friend. And that's why I think people loved him so much. His music is because they felt like he was their friend, even though they didn't know him.
Well, and what a poet, too. I mean, you say, poetry. He wrote the poetry, too. He was quite a keen observer,
Here is a poem that my lady.
I want to ask you about some specific tracks. There's, probably a dozen artists that have that one or two songs that they wrote that they didn't release as a single that has become famous. It's become as big as any number one hit or any top 10 hit that they had, because it's an album track that means so much to people. And over the years, it just grows in folklore and people just loving it. And to me, there's a place in the world for a gambler. It's that song.
Without a doubt.
A masterpiece.
It really is a masterpiece. And I got to tell you, I've got a great story. Okay, so Joe Walsh and Barnstorm had been on the road that whole year when it was time for us to go. And we'd been, we were getting ready to go and do the next record. As soon as we finished Dan's, it was getting close to Christmas. And we were singed by the time we did the last, The Gambler. And so we had the track. It was fantastic. We were all excited. And then Dan goes, "Kenny, I want you to do this ba 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 ba." And I said, well, okay. And that's why I get credit for sousaphone. You know, on The Gambler it says sousaphone because it was a brass part. Dan made a joke of it. It was a signature piece that Dan came up with at the last minute, the brilliant guy that he was. He was always looking to do things better, and he was quite masterful of insisting on how it should be done. I was in the studio cutting it. Everybody was exhausted, and I just didn't get it right. And it was over and over. And it was one of those things where I'm sitting there with the bass, and I'm looking at the glass, and they're going, they're talking amongst each other. And I'm going, oh my God, what am I going to do? And finally, I said, you know what? Let's stop. We'll do it tomorrow. The next day, I went back to the hotel and I was like, wow, what the hell? Why can't? And then I got back and I said, I know what it is. And I said, no, I'm doing this in the control room. Like Bill and I, we did Barnstorm stuff when I wanted to do an overdub. So we did one take and it was done. It's a great track. And look at the background singers. The Gambler has something really special. It really does. Revisit Illinois. Better Change was, that was with Don Henley. It was interesting because at that period of time, I don't think Joe was, I don't think that they were grooming him for the Eagles. Joe was still, single artist and whatever. But it was a chance for Don and for the two of us to play. We've been friends, but man, Henley lays it down, bro. That feel it's got a great feel to it. So that Illinois Gambler, part of the plan, can I say?
Yeah, very special artist, Dan Fogelberg.
Indeed.
Souvenirs was really his coming out party. I mean, I know he had an album before that, but this was the album that really put him out there and started to make him a household name. Tell me about your relationship with Dan and about Souvenirs and take us through that.
I had found Joe Walsh in 1968 and signed the James Gang and did all the James Gang albums that Joe was in the band. And I moved to Colorado, and shortly after Joe left the James Gang and moved to Colorado to start his solo career. And then we did, Barnstorm and then Smoky a Drink and so on and so forth. So I'd been with Joe and I had worked together for, maybe 10 albums, When Dan Fogelberg's first album came out, he turned me on to it and said, this guy's really good. These are the great songs. Later on, he said, I want to produce Fogelberg's next album. But he'd never produced anybody before, Joe. So he said, would you just come and engineer and every now and then you and I'll go out in the parking lot and we'll have a talk. So it was just, sort of him having me as a safety valve, if you will.
The production on Souvenirs that he did was tremendous. I think that.
Well, again, I have to hand a lot of that, and I know this because I was there. Bill Simzik, man. Because Joe, at the very beginning, he hadn't produced. I mean, he'd done some stuff with the James Gang, but all of a sudden you've got an artist like Dan who knows what he wants. He's demanding. And that's when Bill got on board. And at the record plant, Bill was very much a part of getting the sounds and making sure everything was correct there. And, we always called him the coach because he was always there. He wasn't a musician, but he knew.
So I engineered the first 2 sessions. I think we did like 8 tracks in 2 days. And with all our guys, Kenny and Russ Kunkel and Walsh obviously playing. and Paul Harris and people like that, my gang. And after those 2 days, basically, I checked out. I said, "You got it. You're rocking." I turned them over to my assistant engineer, and Joe finished it. So it was just getting him off on the right foot, with the basic tracks, the main deal. And after he got underway, and it was like he got comfortable, and everybody got comfortable with the situation, and I went back to my day job, the Eagles.
What do you think made Dan so special on the production?
Songwriting.
Yeah.
Yep. Songwriting. That first and foremost. Yes, he's a great singer. Yes, he's a great performer. But first and foremost, if you don't have a song, you're dead in the water. And he had plenty of them. Seemed like an endless supply.
I'm your boy.
He was an unbelievable blues guitar player. A lot of people don't know that. He's so good at so many other things, but as an actual electric guitar player, he could rip, man. He really could rip it.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about Innocent Age. That's like, really, people forget, I think, it was a double album, but that was really one of the first albums to have a ton of hits from an artist. Because you have 4 top 20 hits, 3 of them went to the top 10. It was a big album.
I was told at that time period, he had more hits for Epic than Michael Jackson did at that point in terms of one album having that many hits.
Took her groceries to the checkout stand.
Innocent Age was incredible because we were, I didn't play on the entire record, but we were around each other a lot while he was doing it. And he was so hands-on, with the photography, everything. And to have his idols like Joni, Glenn Frey with the big hit.
It's hard to say where love went wrong.
It was a masterpiece of an accomplishment for Dan as an artist.
And it's a run for the roses.
So that, when it comes down to it, he was the conductor, the artist, the composer, and he was the arranger at the same time.
Drank a toast to innocence. We drank a toast.
Same Old Lang Syne and a song like that, and the leader of the band.
Leader of the band is tired and his eyes are growing old.
You hear those songs and there's just such a purity to that voice that it's already a poetic song, but you put the voice with it, and it's perfection to me, those songs.
He had the gift and the experience how to do this. He sang harmonies to himself. He was impeccable at that.
To the leader of the band.
That's why he'd always have a couple cocktails and early on, and he'd say, Eagles always wanted me to join. He always felt like he was the fifth Eagle early on, but he had to do what he had to do by himself.
Was that ever really a thing about him possibly being the Eagles? Because I've heard that here and there.
It was a thing. It was a thing early on. And I think he even told me, they asked him, I think because he was close with Glenn and Don. I really think there was a possibility that could have happened. But I think Dan really wanted to do his own thing. He could have been a great part of that group.
Yeah.
But I think he wanted to make his own decisions. And I think having a group was not in a group with that type of talent and ego. And he was the young guy, he was the baby. All of us were a lot older a few years older than him. So I think he saw his place. He was great friends with J.D. Souther. All of us, it was a whole group of people that kind of grew up together in the business. Dan was always, we talked about this a lot. I was the best man at his first wedding. I saw him, and by the time he got to number 3, the woman that was with him to the very end, Dan Fogelberg, we spent a lot of time together, and I couldn't believe when he got sick. It was just it was heartbreaking for me. So it was a tough, because he didn't want to see anybody. He wanted, he was up in Deer Isle, up in Maine, and it was real hard for me not to have closure there. But the memories that we have, the times, we spent a lot of time together.
Thank you for the music and your stories of the road.
I've had a different gift. It came to me in a different way. I've been able to reach and touch people with these songs that I write.
The leader of the band is tired and his eyes are growing old.
Make sure to get your copy of Souvenirs on 180-gram vinyl. You can get it at the link right here or in the description below and celebrate his breakthrough album. Let's have a great discussion below celebrating Dan Fogelberg and his incredible catalog.